Welcome to the Phase 5 CAQH CORE Prior Authorization 278 Request Response Data Content Rule tutorial. Thank you for joining today. Before we dive into the rule requirements, I'd like to set the stage by reviewing CORE's vision for prior authorization to introduce targeted change to propel the industry collectively forward to a prior authorization process optimized by automation, thereby reducing administrative burden on providers and health plans and enhancing timely delivery of patient care. Phase 4 was the first part of this. Highlights of the Phase 4 infrastructure requirements include connectivity requirements to facilitate information exchange between providers and health plans, real-time and batch processing of prior authorization requirements, acknowledgments of receipt of a prior authorization request, and responses within specified timeframes. The Phase 5 operating rules built upon these foundational infrastructure requirements to address needed data content in the prior authorization standard electronic transaction and enable greater consistency across other prior authorization exchange mechanisms. Ongoing efforts in 2019 include piloting test requirements for a provider to determine whether an authorization is needed and updating the Phase 4 rule with the time frame for final determination. Finally, during this tutorial, we may refer to the concept of the spectrum of automation. We know that the prior authorization process is bifurcated and constructed in silos, and that different parts of the process are more automated than others. The Phase 5 CAQH CORE Prior Authorization 278 Request Response Data Content Rule targets one of the most significant problem areas in the prior authorization process: requests for medical services that are pended due to missing or incomplete information, primarily medical necessity information. These rule requirements reduce the unnecessary back and forth between providers and health plans and enable shorter adjudication timeframes and fewer staff resources spent on manual follow-up. Specific rule requirements include consistent patient identification and verification to reduce common errors and denials, return of specific AAA error codes and action codes when certain errors are detected on the request, return of healthcare service decision reason codes to provide the clearest explanation to the submitter, use of PWK codes or logical identifiers, names, and codes, plus a PWK code to provide clear direction on status and what is needed for adjudication, detection and display of all code descriptions to reduce burden of interpretation. Okay, let's talk about what's in scope. This prior authorization 278 data content rule applies to the version 5010-278 request response transactions for prior authorizations for procedures, laboratory testing, medical services, devices, supplies, or medications within the medical benefit. The rule also applies when any HIPAA-covered entity and its agent uses, conducts, or processes that transaction. There are many business events that this transaction supports. I'll now highlight the business events supported by the transaction that these rule requirements do not apply to. Referrals are not included in the scope because the focus of this data content rule is truly to mitigate the pain points for prior authorization requests for medical services that are pended due to the need to prove medical necessity. Many surveys revealed this use case as one of the most common reasons for pens and denials, while our environmental scan and subsequent subgroup and workgroup polling consistently did not find referral requests to be routinely delayed. Emergency and urgent requests are also out of scope, as the ACA prohibits requirements for prior authorization to access emergency services. Finally, it should be noted this rule does not apply to prior authorizations for retail pharmacy services and medications, given that the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs covers these standards and operating rules, and are therefore not addressed in the CAQH CORE operating rules. This slide shows a zoomed out view of the deeper dives we'll be getting into on the subsequent slides. Each data content requirement bucket is listed on the left-hand side, and you'll see color-coded dots to indicate who each requirement applies to. Each requirement traces back to those challenges and high-level solutions that we highlighted earlier. We learned in our extensive environmental scan that health plans most often pend or deny a prior authorization request due to missing, incomplete, or inaccurate information submitted on the request, including patient identification. To encourage more consistent and accurate submission of patient information, this requirement specifies the data field in which a provider must submit identifying information if the patient is a subscriber, as well as the data field in which a provider must submit identifying information if the patient is a dependent. When the health plan and its agent receive the request, they should normalize the patient last name. Normalization applies to specific characters in the patient's last name, including punctuation values, special characters, uppercase letters, name suffixes, and prefixes. By requiring character strings to be removed during name normalization and recommending a set of punctuation values to be used to delimit last name from suffix or prefix, normalization promotes successful adjudication of information included on the request and reviewed by health plans. On the bottom of this slide, you'll see what is out of scope for this rule requirement. The requirement does not require core certified entities to internally store data elements, require conversion of lettercase and/or special characters by any party for subsequent processing of the data through external systems, specify whether the full last name or only a portion of the last name must be validated, or specify the search criteria. The data content rule requirements also address scenarios where the information included on a response does not provide sufficient detail to know why a request was pended and what information a health plan needs to resolve the pend. The rule requires that the health plan and its agent must return the appropriate HCR1 action code of A for pended, as well as the appropriate HCR3 industry code, and either the appropriate PWK attachment report type code or a logical observation identifier's name and code and the appropriate PWK attachment report type code. This enables providers to know what type of additional documentation are required by the health plan in order for their prior authorization requests to be fully adjudicated. To encourage movement towards a more automated and streamlined processing of the request and flagging the need for additional documentation, the rule requirement also requires that the health plan process submitted diagnosis, procedure, and revenue codes that fall into types of services that are often pended for medical necessity. This will allow for the industry to make progress in building logic into adjudication systems for prior authorization. Categories of services included in the rule are shown at the bottom of the slide. It should be noted that this requirement uses the standard terms as used in the 278 Technical Report Type 3. The rule does not require providers to submit diagnosis or procedure codes. The next bucket of requirements all fall under the umbrella of consistent use of codes to indicate errors, decisions, and next steps. Consistent and uniform use of AAA error and action codes requires the return of the most specific AAA error and action codes in response when certain errors are detected in the request. Additionally, using healthcare service decision reason codes requires that a second HCS DRC be returned in the HCR segment to the submitted in addition to the required code to send the most comprehensive information back to the provider. And finally, the detection and display of the 278 response data elements requires the receiver of the 278 response to detect and extract all data elements, data element codes, and corresponding code definitions to which the rule applies in the 278 response. The rule also requires the receiver to display or otherwise make the data appropriately available to the end user without altering the semantic meaning of the 278 response data content. This will assist with easing the burden of interpretation of codes on provider staff to understand next steps. Thank you for listening to this tutorial. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions.